Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. And wow, I am very pleased to have with us Joseph P. Farrell. And his website is Giza, Giza, deathstar.com. And as many of you already know, Joseph holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. He's a prolific writer. He is into classical music. God bless him. That's my bailiwick, too. And alternative history and sciences and all kinds of strange stuff. And he fits right in here at the Byte Show. So we are planning a big multi-part series with Joseph because an hour does not do justice to the work and the research that this man has been doing. Hi, Joseph.
Hi. Thank you for having me on.
I'm very pleased that you are here. And, wow. Okay. With your books, can you kind of give us an overview of the books that you have written? And I know we're going to get into technology tonight, so
sure.
You just take it away.
Well, there are currently 6 books out, and then there will be a 7th one coming out in the spring. So I'll just kind of review them or survey them in the order they were written and kind of the order I intended them to be read. I kind of am one of those writers that plots things out fairly well in advance, so I had more or less a kind of a plan in mind when I wrote all of these in this particular sequence. But the first one is called the Giza Death Star. It basically is an overview or kind of an introduction to my hypothesis of what I think the Great Pyramid was. And just to summarize that very briefly, I believe that the Great Pyramid was a very, very ancient weapon of mass destruction that was built very, very long ago by a technologically sophisticated and advanced society that actually predates ancient Egypt. So I'm one of those people that do not believe that the Great Pyramid was built by Egyptians at all. I believe it's a much, much older structure.
Agreed.
Then the second book in that series is called The Giza Death Star Deployed. That is a more technical look at some of the science and engineering that I believe was behind the Great Pyramid, as well as a look at the scenario I believe that it was actually used in. So it's kind of a double-track book, that second book, in that I'm concerned not only with technology, but outlining a kind of a scenario that I believe that it was used in. And then the third book actually is a departure from the Pyramid series, although readers of my books will soon pick up that they all kind of dovetail very intentionally into each other. The third book is called Reich of the Black Sun, and the subtitle of that book is Nazi Secret Weapons and the Cold War Allied Legend. That book basically is a book about what I believe to have been a very successful Nazi atom bomb project. And the reason I wrote that book is that after German reunification, that event really was a signal historical event in terms of alternative history research. Because what it did is it kicked loose a lot of the classified archival material from World War II that remained locked up in the vaults and archives of the United States and Great Britain particularly, but also to a lesser extent some of the Eastern European nations like Poland and the Soviet Union, of course. So there was a lot of material that came out, and much of it actually made a very compelling and strong circumstantial case that, in fact, the end of World War II and the history of the atomic bomb project requires a lot closer scrutiny than the legend that we have been taught, and hence the subtitle of the book. So that book kind of falls as an intermission in the Pyramid series. But once readers get into the different books, they'll see why I kind of sequenced it that way. And then the third book in the Pyramid series, which is actually the fourth book in the chronological order that they were published, is called The Giza Death Star Destroyed. And it's kind of funny. That book's kind of funny because it's the most neglected of the three pyramid books, but in its own way, it's the most important one because I get into more of the scenario that I believe that it was used in, as well as some of the modern contemporary theoretical physics papers that tend to go into the science that I believe was behind its use as a weapon of mass destruction. So it's a very important work. And the other thing that in that book I attempt to do is I try to outline also the connection of this ancient lost technology to the rise of various mystery religions and secret societies, because I believe that this is definitely a component of the esoteric tradition that doesn't get much play, it doesn't get much research, but I believe that there is an element within esotericism that is a deliberate and conscious attempt to recover that lost technology and then, by implication, the weaponry that was fought in a terrible ancient war. So it's a very important work. Again, it tends to be neglected by most readers, but it's probably the most important of the three pyramid books. They all kind of lead up to that one. Then the fifth book is a return again to the subject of Nazi secret weapons, and in particular, I don't know how to describe this. It's the most highly classified secret research project inside of the Third Reich during World War II. The project itself was called The Bell, and the book is called The SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and then its subtitle is NASA's Nazis, JFK, and Magic 12. And that book, again, I'm not a big self-promoter of my books. I believe that they should just kind of promote themselves, and if they're worth it, then people will buy them by word of mouth, and if they're not, they'll be ignored. And to my surprise, that book has been a fairly steady seller, I think largely due to its sensational contents. Of all the books, I think it's probably the most sensational in that this secret weapon that the Nazis were working on really was delving into areas of physics that had the potential of creating a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a kitchen match. So it's a very, very compelling book, and at the same time, it's one of those books you don't want to read before you go to bed because it's not a cheery book. Yeah. But it's an interesting book, and it may sound kind of strange that I lumped so many things into that book, the paperclip scientists and the Kennedy assassination and the Magic 12 group, but as readers who actually read the book will find out, I do research and footnote my things very carefully, and I do attempt to draw connections and dots and so on and so forth. And when I speculate, I should let your listeners know that in all of my books, they are all well footnoted. But in all of my books, when I am speculating, I do let the reader know that that's what I'm doing. Yeah. I don't like this tendency in alternative literature, where you channel messages from Ra or your anonymous source, and then
I don't like that either.
It gives the field a pretty bad name, and rightly so. I mean, excuse me. If we're going to write about these things, we should attempt to document at least to the extent that we're able, and when we speculate, we should at least point that out. But then the book that just came out, in fact, it's so recent I haven't even received my complimentary copies from my publisher yet, so it's really just out. But that book is called The Cosmic War, and then its subtitle is Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. That book is kind of a companion piece to the three pyramid books in the following way. In it, I go into a much more extensive examination of the actual scenario of an ancient cosmic war. I look at the texts, particularly from ancient Egypt and from Sumeria, that indicate that a war was fought. And I attempt to interpret those texts literally and then demonstrate on the basis of an examination of science what is involved in their descriptions of the weapons that these gods and so on used to fight that war. So it's a very interesting book. It's definitely complementary to the pyramid books, but I should stress one very important thing. The weapons hypothesis that I describe in the pyramids books does not stand or fall on the truthfulness or lack thereof of the cosmic war scenario. And conversely, the cosmic war scenario does not stand or fall on the truthfulness of the Great Pyramid being an ancient weapon of mass destruction. That being said, the two different books or series of books certainly dovetail into each other, and I do go into a further kind of secondary case in that particular book why I think on the basis of textual evidence from ancient texts that the Great Pyramid was indeed a weapon of some sort of mass destruction. So they are all kind of interrelated books, and the key theme in all of them is that the basic science that the ancient pre-Egyptian civilization was exploring, as well as the science that the Nazis were exploring with this Bell device, was effectually one and the same thing. And that's the reason that the books are sequenced in that rather odd way. Just a final note about the seventh book, which is supposed to be out next spring. That's kind of a sequel to the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. So I can't really give out the title because we don't know what the title of it's going to be yet. So
okay. That's okay. We'll be getting there soon.
Right.
You know, in a future audio file. You talk about occult influence. Mm-hmm. We talk about that a great deal on the Byte show. Mm-hmm. Otherworldly influences that take hold of people and seem to drive them into certain knowledge.
Right.
And it is, from my point of view, it is stuff that's against God.
Right.
We can go back to the war in heaven and all of those things. With this technology, I think today we have technology that's at least, just throwing out a figure, 100 years in advance of what anybody out there knows. Mm-hmm. I really think, Joseph, that we have technology that allows us to go to the moon and back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that we may have something set up on Mars. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But I kind of see it that way.
Well, that's an interesting point, and I'd like to kind of address that.
Oh, good.
There are really two ways that we can approach this, and one of the things that readers of all of those books will kind of quickly pick up on, because I do go rather extensively in the second pyramid book and in the two books on Nazi secret weapons, into a kind of a history of physics that most people are not aware of. And let's go back to James Clerk Maxwell in about the middle of the 19th century. He is, of course, the physicist, the very famous physicist, who formulated the equations of electromagnetic theory. Prior to this point in the history of science, magnetism and electricity had been viewed as two very separate forces. Mm-hmm. But as experimental observations quickly demonstrated, they were somehow related. Well, it was actually Maxwell that formulated the equations that showed how they were basically two different effects of the same underlying geometry. Yeah. Now, the important thing about Maxwell's equations, and if there are physicists or students of physics listening in your audience, this will be a very important thing for them to research, because he formulated these equations, in a mathematical language called quaternion geometry, which is not hardly ever used in physics anymore. And one of the effects of this mathematical language was that he was dealing in 22 variables, 22 unknowns. And one of the effects of this was that most of his thinking about electromagnetic energy actually concerned itself with stress in the medium rather than with forces acting on a particle, moving it from one point to another, which is what most modern physics students learn as his theory. So we can already see that something has happened to Maxwell, and in fact, it was a later British physicist by the name of Oliver Heaviside in the 1880s and the 1890s who changed the mathematical language of his original equations into the language of the equations that students learn as his equations now. So in other words, there is perhaps not a deliberate cover-up, but there certainly has been a change in physics from that day. Now, the other thing I'd point out, you mentioned 100 years. It's very interesting, that figure, because if we go back 100 years, the quintessential name in experimental and even theoretical physics was, in fact, not Albert Einstein. It was Nikola Tesla.
Yes.
And it's very interesting when you read his published articles and so on. Tesla published very, very few of his actual theoretical scientific papers. When he did so, most of the time he would incorporate his thinking into his patents. Mm-hmm. So if we go back and we look at Tesla's published articles and compare them to his patents, by that time in history, he is definitely onto a completely different form of electromagnetic energy than alternating current. And it has to deal with, of course, his famous claim that he was able to transmit power without wires. And the form of energy that he was using to do this was a longitudinal wave. Now, basically, to describe for your listeners what that is if we have two people stand up in the middle of a room and put a jump rope between them, and one person jerks the rope up and down, it's going to transmit a sine wave to the other person. That's a typical Hertz wave. And that's the kind of wave that most electromagnetic energy is. That's the kind that we're used to thinking about when we think of it. But a longitudinal wave is actually kind of like a sound wave. It's a pressure wave. So if we have those same two people stand up and extend a yardstick between them, and the person on one end of the yardstick pushes it, all of that energy is immediately transmitted in the pulse to the other person. So it's a very effective way of transmitting energy because very little of that energy is dissipated in the transmission. So a longitudinal wave of electromagnetic energy is almost the same thing, if not identical, to the kind of stress in the medium or fabric of space-time itself that Maxwell was talking about. So in effect, what Tesla was doing was providing kind of experimental validation of some of the original ideas that Maxwell had formulated in his theory. And again, all of this aspect of Tesla's work is virtually lost or ignored. And we know, of course, the famous story of how Morgan suppressed this aspect of Tesla's physics. So there has been, I believe, particularly when we consider Tesla, there has been a concerted and deliberate effort to keep certain ideas and certain names out of the physics textbooks. So we can, at least from Tesla's point, I think, with some justification, speak of an intentional cover-up within physics. Now, let's go to the other thing. You mentioned the moon and the possibility that we have had a much different and much more advanced technology for space travel than has been publicly admitted. Well, I find that a very interesting observation because just this last week, of course, NASA launched a rocket that is going to the asteroid belt. And this rocket is a unique first in terms of the public admissions of the space agency, in that it utilizes an ion propulsion drive. Now, ion propulsion drives, you can ask anybody that's familiar with the literature and particularly the patent literature. This is a drive and a technology that's literally been around for some 2 to 3 decades in a practical, usable, applicable fashion. So in other words, it's taken 30 years for NASA to construct or at least admit that it has a technology that's very different from a standard chemical rocket. So that aspect has to be looked into. But there's another one concerning the moon itself. And I go into this particularly in the first 2 Pyramid books and then again in SS Brotherhood of the Bell. The Nazis came up with, I believe, a kind of a prototypical field propulsion technology with this Bell device. But it's interesting that when we bring their paperclip scientists to this country and have them work on our Apollo moon project, that their most famous scientist, Dr. Werner von Braun, gave an interview to Time magazine. This was approximately, I think, about 2 to 3 weeks after our first Apollo moon landing. And oops, hello?
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay, I thought I heard the line go dead.
Yeah, it did for a second.
When he gave this interview to Time magazine, he quoted a figure for the neutral point of gravitational attraction between the Earth and the Moon as being some 43 to 45,000 miles from the surface of the Moon. Now, that may not seem like too big of a deal, except that approximately 2 weeks after he gave that interview, for no apparent reason, he suddenly resigned all of his positions at NASA and became a private consultant and director for Fairchild Industries in Alabama. And I suspect that when we look at the reasons behind the possible sudden resignation, that it may be the case that he was told or forced to resign because he had let slip a vital clue of information. And that is that 43 to 45,000 figure itself. Because if we crunch the numbers, that figure will yield a much more massive moon than the 1/6 gravitational attraction of the Earth that we were told prior to the Apollo landings that the moon had. Now, this means, in blunt honesty, that the little rocket that we had on the Lunar Excursion Module, the LEM that we saw taking off from the surface of the moon, that little rocket was probably completely insufficient to reach escape velocity and get the crew cabin off the surface of the moon and back up to the command module orbiting above. Right. It would imply then that an alternative technology had to be in play in order for us to get off of the moon. Now, I find that a kind of an interesting thesis because, as I point out in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, if we look at the television shots of the LEM taking off from the moon, it does not appear to have the signature of a rocket. A rocket accelerates geometrically, moving a little bit further per unit of time, each unit of time. So if we look at those television shots, the thing just appears to pop up at more or less a uniform rate of acceleration and fly away smoothly on its own. Now, that's something that the so-called Apollo hoaxers have always pointed to as being, this patent, flat evidence that the whole thing was hoaxed. I am not in that camp. I do believe we went. However, I do believe that particular anomaly may signal something entirely different. It may not signal that the thing was hoaxed. It may signal the presence of a different alternative and very covert technology that got us off the moon.
Well, I've also thought of this business where a lot of people say they'll point to photographs and they'll say, well, you see the shadow doesn't do,
right.
and they go through this long thing. Well, my thought on that, Joseph, has been, I'm pretty sure we went, but maybe what they saw when they landed caused them to do a Hollywood-type production of the landing.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
They did not show the actual films that
right.
were from the moon.
Well, I am in that camp as well, and I believe that on occasion people such as Richard Hoagland and Mark Carlotto and some others that have been prominent investigators in the Mars mysteries have entertained that hypothesis too. Don't cite me on that because I'm not certain of this, but it's my memory seems to recall that these were things that they mentioned on some of their radio appearances and some of their articles. But it certainly stands to reason that if we accept the hypothesis that Mr. Hoagland and so many others have pointed out, that there are very anomalous things, if not to mention just plain old-fashioned outright artifacts on the moon, that this would be a very plausible scenario then for NASA to have adopted. So I would tend to be in your camp on that one.
Well, and when we look at, I'm trying to remember if it was Bob Lazar, maybe, one night years ago when he was on a radio program with Art Bell. I think it was Bob Lazar who said this, but don't quote me. One of the men that night said that we have technology to go to the moon and back for lunch. And this was a number of years ago. And I just, and one of the other gentlemen that's on the Byte show, Roger Taggart, he was with Army Intelligence, and his business with that was detailing photographs.
Right.
And he came up with some photographs that were put up on the NASA website that it's amazing.
Oh, yes, it is. It is.
If someone does point it out to you, you can see these artifacts up there.
Oh, yes. And again, of course, the one that has been trumpeting and maintaining this position with some degree of scientific rigor for any number of years has been Richard Hoagland. And he himself gave a series of lectures, I believe it was at Ohio State University, where he pointed out some very, very unusual features that were present in the official NASA Apollo moon mission photographs. And there, to my mind's eye, there are some people that would look at these pictures and not be able to see what he's pointing out, but I happen to agree with him that many of these photos are just very, very anomalous any way you slice them. And again, if that were the case, then I think, yes, the scenario of some sort of disinformation or misinformation has to be put in play as a speculative possibility simply because of the kind of policies that NASA adopted prior to going there. So, that idea would be consistent with their own internal policy statements and memoranda. The other thing that you mentioned in your comment was the existence of an alternative technology, and I know that we'll be getting into some of this as our interviews proceed. But briefly put, we can go back to Operation Paperclip and the bringing to this country of massive amounts of Nazi scientists.
Oh, yes.
Not only their rocket scientists, but their aerodynamic engineers, their so-called concentration camp doctors. And I should stress one thing about that aspect of Paperclip, grisly though it is. These concentration camp doctors, when we read about some of their experiments, and they truly are barbaric, there's just no way to slice it any other way. But if we read what they were doing and the descriptions of some of these things, it's my belief and opinion that if we look at the details of the experiments very carefully, that what they were really doing was trying to lay the foundations for modern space medicine. So, you know, even that aspect of Operation Paperclip, barbaric though it is, had at least a rationalization on our part that it was necessary for our space program in order to jumpstart it. So there's that aspect of things. But if we mix into this blend the idea that the Nazis may have achieved some breakthrough in a prototypical technology that gave them control or the ability to manipulate locally the fabric of space and time, then we have opened the door to the possibility that they also had a technology that was possibly used for field propulsion, that would have been weaponizable as a weapon again, that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker, a whole host of things. If indeed we got our hands on that technology, and I think it's a questionable idea if we did. I'm not saying the technology didn't exist. I'm merely maintaining we may not have been the ones to get it. But if we did, then we have had 60 years since the end of the war to perfect that technology.
Oh, yes.
And you cannot tell me that with the amount of money that is drained away in the federal budget into black projects, which, again, that budget is almost completely off the books.
Right.
If you factor that in and you factor into that equation that the American aerospace industry has whole departments dedicated to the development of black projects, then yes, I think we have to admit the possibility, as a speculation, that a technology may indeed exist that would be capable of giving us practical, short-term, short-time flight capability to our nearest celestial neighbors. Now, that's a whopper, I realize.
Yeah.
But I think once we get further into these interviews, I think that people will understand why I entertain the possibility.
Well, you know, I want to say right here that the work that you have done and are doing, Joseph, is going to bless many people with understanding. Your research, the way you have put your books together, and I love the footnotes.
Thank you.
I love it. I like books that have footnotes. You know, and I mean it sincerely. This is going to bless many people because there is this fracas that goes on about UFOs and aliens from other planets and stuff like that. And I think that they have been very good at using this alien stuff as a screen, a smoke screen for what they're doing.
Oh, yes, definitely. I believe that this is specifically the case with Roswell and a couple of other famous crash and retrieval cases.
Right.
As you know, the subtitle of SS Brotherhood of the Bell includes the term Magic 12. And in both Reich of the Black Sun and in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, one of the things that I do is I take the so-called Cooper-Cantwheel Magic 12 documents, and I subject them to an analysis of their internal evidence concerning the technology allegedly recovered. Now, I want to stress something for your listeners in that respect. I am not concerned in the books with an examination of the authenticity of those documents. That is not my argument. My argument is based on if their authenticity is granted for the sake of argument, then does the internal evidence describing the recovered technology compel to a conclusion that whatever was recovered was extraterrestrial. And in my examination of those documents' own descriptions of this technology, the answer is no. It is certainly exotic, but it is not exotic enough, in my mind, to suggest a physics that is sufficient for practical interstellar, or even for that matter, really practical interplanetary travel. So if that is kept in mind, then my hypothesis is that when the military recovered what it recovered at Roswell, which I do believe was something exotic, don't get me wrong. I'm not in the Japanese balloon bomb camp. I'm certainly not in the Air Force's various explanations of weather balloons or crashed mogul balloons, which is their latest official explanation, and it goes on and on. I'm just not in that camp. I do believe that it was an extraordinary event. There's no two ways of slicing it. There's too many witnesses that have come forward that claim to have seen too many different things, particularly with respect to the recovered debris. But that being said, I find it very peculiar that in the Magic 12 documents, the evidence that would tend to support the extraterrestrial hypothesis is all blacked out, namely descriptions of the supposedly recovered ET bodies. So on the basis of the extant evidence, to maintain that it was something ET is really an argument from silence, which is illogical. So we're thrown back to the technology, and what my hypothesis is that what crashed there was probably something Nazi. Now let's examine that for a moment. That may just sound absolutely hysterically ludicrous, but if we pause and consider just a moment why that would make sense. It's 2 years after the end of the world's bloodiest war. It took the combined might of the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and literally scores of lesser nations to put down the military machine of Nazi Germany. It took 6 years to put down a country the size of the state of Texas. Now, having fought this war, if something Nazi crashes 2 years after the supposed end of the war in the New Mexico desert, then that will send the American military into an absolute tailspin of panic. Because what it means is that somebody, somewhere in the world, is independently pursuing all of those lines of Nazi research, free of the oversight of any of the so-called victorious powers of World War II. So my hypothesis is that it's precisely something like that crashed at Roswell, and that the ET angle to the story is actually probably a final, deep cover layer bit of disinformation. And the reason I suggest that hypothesis is, once again, if we go to the Cooper-Cantwell documents and examine the internal evidence, one of the most peculiar things, and I've got to be honest with you, when I read this in the documents, it just my jaw just sort of dropped, because in the documents they indicate that the paperclip scientists were brought in to look at this wreckage and give their opinion. Now, this means that we have a bunch of ex-Nazis, Werner von Braun, Theodor von Karman, Hermann Oberth, and Artur Rudolph, and anybody else that happened to be there in New Mexico at the time, coming up and looking at this so-called flying saucer for our military and rendering their opinion of what it was. Now, from the standpoint of logic and military operations and security compartmentalization and all of that, to me, this just does not make sense if our American military suspected for one instant that what it had in its possession was genuinely extraterrestrial. I don't think the last people that they would be bringing in to look at it would be a bunch of ex-Nazis that are tinkering around with our rockets. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Unless something about the recovered technology looked German.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's funny because even Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, and I cite these two as epigraphs, even Lieutenant Colonel Corso in his Day After Roswell implies very strongly in a couple of statements that something about the technology looked German, and that's why the paperclip scientists were consulted. So, from any angle that we pursue this, and again, it's an argument based on the internal evidence of the documents themselves, not based on their authenticity. If they're proven unauthentic, then of course the argument collapses. But, so much has been made of these documents in the UFO community, I just thought, now wait a minute, I'm not reading them that way at all. They can be read another way entirely.
Right.
And, since I've mentioned Colonel Corso, if you don't mind, I want to get off into that area for a moment, too, because it follows up with your ET question.
Yeah.
As everyone knows, Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, is based on the thesis or the premise that we recovered technology there and that certain aspects of this technology were then gradually seeded into American industry and became the basis for the technological revolution that we see today. And he cites specifically things like Kevlar, lasers, fiber optics, and the transistor. Now, I want to point out the transistor. I deal with all of these things in the book, but the transistor is particularly important to me, as it was to Colonel Corso. Corso points out in his book, quite rightly, I might add, that the history of the development of the transistor is very obscure at best. Right. It just sort of all of a sudden pops out of Bell Laboratories, and we don't really know why. It's just there. Well, he is correct in pointing that out, but we don't need ET to explain it. Because, as I point out in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and you've seen the picture of this thing, in 1940, the German firm of Telefunken brought out a little klystron tube, which is a particular kind of vacuum tube, that's about as large as the last knuckle on your pinky finger. It's a very tiny little tube. Now, the Allied equivalent at the end of World War II to this little tube is 10 times bigger. So in other words, 5 years before the end of World War II, just when things were really, going well for Nazi Germany, in fact, the Germans were successful in miniaturizing their electronic components to an absolutely extraordinary degree. Now, interestingly enough, not only that, but they also pioneered during the war, and even really prior to it, research into semiconductors. Now, these two things, miniaturization of components and semiconductors, are two absolutely essential steps on the technology tree to the transistor. So, in other words, I'm suggesting that ET is a completely fallacious explanation. The technology of the transistor may be obscure precisely because it may be war booty from the end of World War II, brought over here and seeded into American industry, not from ET, but from Nazi technology.
Well, I've got strong reason to believe that the Nazis did possess a great deal of technology that even today we are not aware of.
Oh, yes, I do too.
Military, there is a certain strata of military that is aware of it, or private groups.
Right.
But the public in general are not.
Oh yes, I would completely agree with this. And in fact, to me, the sign or symbol that would verify that hypothesis is precisely the existence of this Bell project itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because the physics that they were investigating there is so extraordinary, and it's literally decades in advance of anything that any of the Allied powers or the Soviet Union, for that matter, were doing during the war or even decades after it. It's just an astonishing thing.
Well, that brings us into... We know, too, that the Nazis were very deep into pharmacokinetics.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And I'll bet that most of the listeners do not know what that is. Please explain it.
Well, essentially, the Nazis, we make a great deal in this country out of the so-called CIA MK-Ultra mind control project.
Right.
And in point of fact, all of this basic groundwork research was done inside of Nazi Germany during the war, and they did everything from testing different types of drugs, methamphetamine, and so on and so forth, on concentration camp victims, but even on their own soldiers, and doing things like testing dosages, testing ways of administering things, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the point of subjecting concentration camp victims to different dosages of x-rays and so on and so forth, just a whole host of things. And the goal was essentially to learn techniques not only of mind manipulation of individuals, but of whole populations.
Yeah.
So, this too is another aspect of this very, very dark and evil history that is an aspect of Operation Paperclip that I don't think has ever really been adequately explored. I do definitely think that there is a connection between the CIA's program and some of this Nazi research. Absolutely.
Well, when we look at those of us who study Scripture, and we talk about pharmacology,
mm-hmm.
pharmacopoeia, rendered as sorcery,
mm-hmm.
in the Greek. I mean,
mm-hmm.
that's what it means. It's sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
What more do people really need to know?
Well, there's even an interesting connection in esoteric and occult literature, because if you read certain heavy-duty texts, not necessarily the ones you buy at your local New Age bookstore, but I mean, the real honest-to-goodness heavy-duty stuff. You'll find references to the use of drugs or other things to help stimulate the activity or potency of whatever type of magic that one is trying to work. And this is always considered in those texts black magic.
Yes.
So in other words, even within esoteric tradition, there is a basis for viewing things this way, because if you view other esoteric texts, they will caution you against doing stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really an aspect in itself that you could literally spend hours and write whole tomes investigating, and it's a very, very old practice, I might add.
But when you take it broader, I know a lot of us think they're putting something in the chemtrails that mm-hmm. Is bad for us. We look at our food; a lot of it's infected. Our air, mm-hmm. our water. There is over 50% or higher of the United States population is on psychotropic drugs,
mm-hmm.
According to one study. But Joseph, I look at all this, and it makes people more tractable for
mm-hmm.
mind control
mm-hmm.
issues. And then, we get into the HARP thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a tangled ball of yarn.
Yes.
And we're all looking to unravel that, and I think you've unraveled a great deal of it.
Well, thank you. I certainly hope I have.
You have. You certainly have. But knowing that they were very involved in the pharmaceutical
mm-hmm.
industry and all these experiments, a lot of our medical science is built or stems from that.
Yes.
And I don't think people really realize that.
Oh, no, there's no question about this. Again, if we go back to what I said previously about the efforts that the Nazis were extending in laying the foundations for modern space medicine. And, again, that should tell us something, too. They were literally trying to create a space program.
Yeah.
And making great and tremendous strides in that arena, because, of course, it didn't take ours very long to get started after World War II, or for that matter, the Soviet Union, to get started after World War II, due to the fact that both countries made away with so many German scientists and technicians.
Right.
So that aspect of the medical history is buried, I think, again, on the part of the government, simply because the moral implications of the deals that were made with paperclip really, we struck the Faustian bargain. And in bringing over the science, we didn't realize, in our naivete, that we had at some point to be dabbling with the ideology that created that science. So yes, I tend to agree with you wholeheartedly there. There's a moral and historical side to this story that really yet has to be adequately plumbed and explored.
Yes. Oh boy. And to take it even a step further.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Decades ago, they said, there's been 40 million abortions in America.
Mm-hmm.
Well, parting out fetuses is big business.
Oh, yes.
And they want human tissue for a lot of experimental exploration.
Yes, oh yes, absolutely.
And,
absolutely.
When we get into these things, we see why it was made, quote, end of quote, okay for women to have abortions.
Right.
And that's murder, see. On the spiritual level, she has committed a sin. She's come under a different influence at that point. They make it a fashionable thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And what they've done with that fetal tissue, I believe, is in black lab places. They have been very busy, if you will, constructing things that look human.
Well, there's more possibilities than just that, and I should stress that I do not get into genetic science other than just very, very briefly and at a very surface level in these different books. But we can look to genetics and look at the papers that have been published in the last 20 to 25 years, even in some cases going much further back.
Yes.
And there are two avenues with this research that genuinely frighten me. One avenue has taken the line or the avenue of using the technique of gene splicing to create chimeras or hybrids, and there has even been talk of creating whole chimerical species, half human, half dolphin, or half pig, half human, whatever. And again, if we go back to ancient texts, and not just biblical texts, if we go back to Sumerian texts or Egyptian texts or even some of the ancient Vedic texts, this activity is talked about in those texts very explicitly and very clearly.
Yeah, yes, it is.
And in every case, the texts hint at, some more strongly than others, that this led to horrendous wars. Some of these chimerical beings were created precisely as weapons.
Yes.
And again, the words of Christ come to mind, as in the days of Noah. well, we're recreating an antediluvian technology, essentially. And the other avenue of genetic research that I also find very appalling, and this is very explicit in the literature, again, is that you can create genetic weapons that will target certain populations that possess particular genes.
Right.
Imagine targeting black people or blue-eyed people or Oriental people, or if it should prove that homosexuals have a peculiar genetic gene or deficiency, homosexuals or whoever, It really is the creation of a technology of genocide in the truly proper sense for the first time, because genocide means precisely the extinction of a genus, of a gene type.
Right.
And, this avenue, again, I find very appalling. And as you point out, in order to bring these types of fantastical programs and projects to fruition, they would of necessity have to be able to use human material, genetic material, to do these types of experiments. So again, just on the basis of the science that would be involved in such projects, I think it is a most plausible speculation that you bring up.
Well, we know just from reading too, Joseph, that they've been very busy in the weaponization of insects, bacteria, viruses, things like that. And the genetics of grains, all kinds of things. I mean, it is a very frightening thing.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And I do agree with you, and listeners have heard me say it must be 100 times, that these technologies existed in the ancient pre-flood world.
Right.
And they were, I do believe, they came from the fallen sons of God or angels or whatever people want to call them.
Well, this is an avenue that I mention in the three pyramid books, and even to a much greater extent in the new book, The Cosmic War, because I want to kind of stress something for your listeners here. When I'm talking about the physics aspect of this story, which is mostly what my books are concerned about, there are indicators, and I get into them a great deal in the new book that's just out. There are indicators in these ancient texts and in modern scientific theory and practice that these chimerical creatures that were talked about in ancient texts may not have been purely mythological, because again, the technology is being recreated, and if we look at these texts carefully, particularly the Sumerian texts, they are just astonishing in the details that they provide that can dovetail or allude very precisely to some of these modern genetical techniques. So in describing this ancient civilization that you're talking about, there are two things that I would have your listeners bear uppermost in their mind. We are maintaining as a necessary component of the hypothesis of that civilization's existence that they, number one, had a very sophisticated physics, and that, number two, they had a very sophisticated genetics.
Oh, yes.
And both of these things in turn, and this is probably going to blow your listeners' minds, but I mention it because it's mentioned, again, in those Magic 12 documents that I referred to earlier on the basis of the internal evidence. Because those documents themselves come out and state very clearly, and they just don't beat around the bush at all, that in examining the so-called recovered ET bodies, one of the conclusions, all the evidence is blacked out, so you don't get to see what led up to this conclusion, but the conclusion is not blacked out. It's just there in all of its stark relief. And it states something to the effect, and I'm going to try and cite it as closely as I can from memory as possible, but it says that science may have to consider, number one, that the human genus is much more present in the galaxy than previously thought. Now, that's an interesting statement in itself.
Sure is.
Particularly the word previously.
Yeah.
And, remembering that this is a document purportedly written in 1947, and I don't recall Darwin ever writing about the extraterrestrials,
Right.
So there's that little statement. And then another statement that's even more breathtaking in its implications, and that is that science may have to consider that biology and physics exist in a higher structured order than previously thought. In other words, what they mean by that is that there had to have been an even more fundamental science that links the two discrete and disparate sciences that we know of as biology and physics in a very explicit, formally specifiable way. In other words, you can sit down and write equations with it.
Yeah.
And one set of solutions will lead to biology and another to physics,
right.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So in other words, this is a breathtaking statement for, even if the documents prove to be unauthentic, it's still a breathtaking statement to be letting out there even as disinformation. Because, again, this implies the existence of a very ancient society, a civilization that's long gone, long extinct from the Earth.
Or left the Earth.
Or left the Earth, yes, exactly. That that opens up a Pandora's box, but it's very plausible. So, it's just... I suppose I should say that by mentioning all these things, I hope that readers or your listeners can now at least understand why I've written books about ancient Egyptian pyramids and Nazi secret weapons, and structured them in the sequence that I did, because these things really are all related.
Well, in the book of Revelation, I believe there's a statement where, and also in the book of Enoch, there is the statement, very similar statement, that God put these evil ones under the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And how many times have we heard from people that were, skulking around in caves,
mm-hmm.
and they saw a strange being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very strange stuff.
Well, this is another aspect, and I do not get into this in the books, but having said that, I should say that much of the research while I was writing these books, I came across these stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting because, I live in the northern Black Hills of South Dakota.
Right.
Now, down towards the southern end of the Black Hills, about an hour south of Mount Rushmore or an hour south of Rapid City,
mm-hmm.
there is a cave that's called Wind Cave. It's a national park. You can actually take guided tours into this thing. But you only get to see about, I would say maybe 5 to 6 miles of this cave.
Mm-hmm.
But the cave system itself is gigantic. It has been explored to the extent of about 147 to 150 miles.
Wow.
And that's not even the end of it. They really have no idea to this date how extensive this cave system is, and it's probably honeycombed all through the hills here, and some of the Black Hills, most people don't realize, are just genuine mountains in their own right.
Mm-hmm.
The highest mountain peak east of the Rockies is, in fact, in South Dakota. So, this cave system, given the geological formation of the Black Hills, may be very, very extensive indeed, and no one really knows the extent of it. So, putting all that together, and kind of dovetailing it with the Nazis here for a moment, the interesting thing is that the Nazis were very aware of these stories, and in fact there's evidence to suggest that they deliberately and consciously sought out some of these caves in the intention of proving certain of these esoteric traditions true. Now, the reason I say that is because in I think it was 35 or 36, Reichsfuhrer Himmler, the head of the SS, established an entire department within the SS, and it was called the Ahnenerbe-Dienst, and translated that literally means the Ancestral Research Bureau. But if you look at Himmler's actual formal decree establishing this department, he states very clearly that its purpose really was to investigate all avenues of the esoteric and the occult for their potential military exploitation. Oh, yeah. And so he literally sent out teams of archaeologists all over the world to Tibet, to some of the famous cave sites in Europe, to Iceland, to South America, digging around trying to find the entrances to these cave systems. And you know, knowing Himmler and his kind of kooky, zany worldview.
Well, they were also trying to find DNA, too.
Oh, yes, I think that's probably true. You know, again, that's definitely under the aegis of this Ancestral Research Bureau. They're looking for traces not only of prototypical so-called Aryan civilization, but they're looking for early Aryans, quite literally. So, you know, this is a story that just spins any number of ways, and I get into some of these strange expeditions in the books. It's just a monstrously complex tale.
Well, like I said, it's like this big tangled up ball of yarn. And,
yeah.
You know, if we can just grab a hold of the right loose thread
and
keep pulling on it, it'll come unraveled.
Well, I just prefer the method of taking a great big huge pair of scissors
and chopping it up. It's much more expedient.
And much more expedient. It's a lot faster.
Darn right. You've got a good point. Wow. This has been exceedingly informative. When is your new book going to be coming out?
Well, it already is out. I talked to the publisher, oh gosh now, you would ask that. I think it was about a week ago, in fact. And the book had just arrived there from the printers, and I was to be sent my complimentary copies by UPS this last week, so it'll probably arrive to me in the coming week. Now, essentially what that means in terms of people ordering the newest book is if they go to Amazon.com right now, they'll see that it's still, they're still saying it's hasn't come out and it's in pre-order. And the reason is that the book has to go from my publisher to the distributor, who then turns around and sends it to the warehouses of Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So that process will be about a week to 2 weeks. But it is officially out, and they can get that book now directly from the publisher as well as all the other books. Okay,
great. And if people want to contact you, how do they do that, Joseph?
To contact me, the easiest way is by email. Okay. And I do have to stress that I get so much email, I tend to go through it very quickly, deleting what I think is spam. So if people email me, the thing that I would ask them to do is to use all capital letters in the subject header of the email. That way I won't delete it. And the way to email me is at vardis3@AOL.com, and I'll spell that first username. It's capital V, like in victory, then little a, R, D as in David, A, S as in Samuel, then the numeral 3, and then at AOL.com. And just remember to use all capitals so that I know that it's an email that I need to open. And the other way is if they prefer snail mail, they can write my publisher directly, and my publisher will forward the letter.
Okay, that's great. And if for people to get your other books, they could go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble?
They can go, yes, to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Borders, or if they prefer to order directly from the publisher, that's Adventures Unlimited Press.
Okay.
Their number is 1-800-718-4514, All of the books except the last one are $16.95. The last one is $18.95, and there is a 10% discount on 3 or more books.
Okay, give the 800 number.
Sure.
Again.
It's 1-800-718-4514. They can also be reached online at www.adventuresunlimitedpress, that's all one word, no spaces or anything, and it's all lowercase, .com.
Okay, LIMITED press.com. adventuresunlimitedpress.com.
Right.
Great. Okay. Yeah. All righty. You and I are going to be talking about some other topics in our next installment.
Sure.
And how about the fabric of space and time?
Sure, that's fine.
And the tinkering they're doing with it. And I think on top of a lot of other things that are going on, Joseph, it's affecting people's ability to think.
Oh, yes, I would agree.
And also, with some people, it's giving them dreams and visions.
I would agree with that as well.
Yeah. So stay tuned, everybody. This is going to get pretty deep. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Joseph P. Farrell signing off tonight, and you can go to Joseph's website, Giza, Giza, deathstar.com, and we will be back, God willing. So, God bless everybody out there listening, and God bless you too, Joseph, for all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Don't hang up. Good night, everybody.